Welcome back, everyone, to Lessons from the Frontline, a regular peer-to-peer learning series that offers an opportunity for you to interact directly with energy access innovators and to gain insights into their challenges and breakthroughs. No presentations, no panels, just you and us, and hopefully a good conversation. This series is brought to you by Energy Catalyst, an Innovate UK program that supports innovators working in Africa and Asia to end energy poverty and achieve Sustainable Development Goal 7. You can learn more about Energy Catalyst at the gov.uk website. In this episode, we are joined by Piyush Mathur and Vijay Bhaskar, both of whom are board members of CLEAN, which is a network of over 200 members from the decentralized renewable energy sector in India. Both are also industry leaders in their own right. Piyush as the former CEO of one of the most successful home solar companies in India, Simpa Networks, which was recently acquired by NG. And Vijay as former managing director of one of the most successful mini-grid companies, Melinda, who's now head of a new company, Hamara Grid. I'm William Brent, the Chief Campaign Officer of Power for All, and I'll be hosting the discussion. Before we dive in, a quick note, thanks already for the questions you've posted to us before today. And we'll continue to take questions from you throughout, so please post your questions in the area marked Q&A at the bottom of your screens. We'll do our best to answer everything in the hour, but if we can't get to it all, we'll try to do so afterwards. We're going to break up the discussion into 4 parts. 1, a market overview of India. 2, a look at the current finance and policy situation for private sector companies operating there. 3, the impact of decentralized renewables in supporting India's broader development goals. And lastly, a mix of general questions that we've received. So with that, welcome Piyush and Vijay.
Thank you, William. Thank you for having me today.
Thank you.
Great to see you both. So let's address the elephant in the room. For anybody who knows anything about what's going on in India, it's a market where the government has already claimed 100% household electrification. So in that context, the general notion of energy access really doesn't apply any longer. Companies are not solving for energy access in India if you adhere to what the government says about 100% household electrification. So why is there still a role for private sector decentralized renewable energy companies? Or in the words of Manoj Wadhwani from Jairam Industries, how is off-grid still helpful for the government's goal of 24/7 power for all? Vijay, do you want to go first?
Yeah. So you're absolutely right, William. The narrative has kind of changed over the last 2-3 years in India. It's no longer about access because almost 100% of the rural communities have access to energy now. The lines are there, but there is a little bit of a problem still, in the sense that though the lines are there, the access to energy 24/7 is not there. So if you look at these villages, and I talk of Eastern India, UP, Bihar, Jharkhand, Orissa, Assam. Now, there used to be an average of about 4 to 5 hours of electricity about 4 or 5 years back per 24-hour cycle, and that's really improved. And today we have on an average about 10 to 12 hours of electricity. Now, 10 to 12 is a bit of a misnomer on many counts. First is reliability. Second is the quality of energy, and by reliability and the randomness. So reliability means that you can't really be sure whether there's going to be electricity at a particular time of day at all. And and the quality of electricity that's supposed to be 230 volts for a single phase is normally between 110 volts and 160 volts. This is an average figure. So why average is a misnomer is really that it's not really that every day you have 10 to 12 hours of electricity. You may have 18 hours of electricity today, and then there'll be a power cut, and you may not have electricity for the next 20 days. So it's really, really difficult for village businesses to be set up, to prosper, to do well. And if everything is about quality of life in the villages, economic development in the rural areas, which is a government priority, I think it's going to be extremely difficult for this to happen. And I think mini grids and DRE have got a huge role to play going forward.
Thanks. Piyush, your thoughts?
Yes, thank you. Well, there are many ways of answering your question, and Vijay has rightly taken a customer sort of oriented view. So to layer on top of what the ground truths that he has just shared with you, I think please bear in mind that India is also very heterogeneous. So when we say that 100% of the villages or 100% of the households are connected, there's a huge amount of variability even today in the quality of access and what sort of energy they're actually receiving. I hear still that in Northeast, we're talking about primary access. They're not even getting enough energy through the grid to meet even 3-4 hours of requirements. On the other hand, in places like Uttar Pradesh and Bihar, which were previously extremely starved, are now receiving anywhere between 12 to 16 hours of electricity. But what's also starting to happen is that improved availability of electricity is starting to express that latent demand which previously never existed and was never visible. So people are getting more and more habituated to the use of electricity as they receive more electricity. They're starting to invest in appliances and applications of electricity which previously they couldn't even have imagined. So what was previously a need is now actually turning into a pain. When you only get 10 hours of electricity, the state of being in electricity and out of it is almost are two equivalent states. But when you receive 15 hours plus of electricity every day, you can't bear not receiving the deficit, because you have now sort of attuned your lifestyle and have got used to employing electricity in your everyday life. So there's obviously a reality where the quality of access and energy availability through the grid itself is patchy, but even in places where it has improved, it has only catalyzed demand for filling in that residual deficit, which previously customers were indifferent to, and now they are sort of really meaning to fill that deficit.
So that deficit, I'm assuming that the conclusion from that is that the private sector companies like Simpa, like Melinda and Hamara have a role to play in filling that gap. And you both alluded to it, but it wasn't mentioned, I don't think directly. You know, Vijay said, you know, the wires are there in many places. You both talked about they being the discoms, right? These are the companies that are state-owned utilities that are responsible for serving these communities, rural last mile communities, that are, you know, I would say generally failing in terms of quality and reliability. So there's questions from Neil at Space 100 and Adriana Fajardo at the Institute of Development Studies that are wondering about, you know, what specifically is the role of private ESCOs versus these distribution companies, the discoms, over the next period of time, and what's the role of private companies to make electricity more affordable? I mean, the discoms have lost money for decades, and now the government's finally looking at the potential for private distribution to come in. So I'm curious, with the dynamic of patchy, unreliable, poor quality electricity from the discoms plus growing demand, what's the vision for the private sector companies like the ones you guys have run?
Okay, let me start on that one. In energy in particular, in India has historically been seen as a social good that is to be provisioned by the government. That, however, has not been true for many other inputs for development. For example, health. We have a pretty sort of vibrant private healthcare system here in India, some of which has also expanded its fangs into rural India. So I think what's happening is that gradually the government as well as the sort of people are both realizing that it's not sort of something that is to be expected only from the government. It's a utility that could actually be sourced from some private practitioners too. So we're in that sort of natural evolutionary process where something is going away from being a social good to be provisioned only by the government to a utilitarian service which can be offered by government or a private sector player. Now that's happened in many of the cities where discoms have already been privatized, but the same example has not yet been replicated nationally. But government has taken several knocks at fixing discoms, Uday being the latest initiative. And yet again, despite all the transparency, despite all the political intent behind fixing the problem, and all the metrics that actually you can see real time on a website, the initiative has not sort of moved the needle in terms of making discoms viable. So understandably, government is now open to the idea of privatizing it, and that privatization is essentially a push for efficiency and viability. What that means for DRE is that it, on the assumption that DRE can sort of hold itself out to be a commercially viable and sustainable solution to the problem of universal energy access 24/7 for everyone, it opens up an opportunity for these private players who are now going to come in to embrace DRE solutions alongside traditional centralized solutions to offer a bouquet of service to their constituent populations or catchment areas in the most economic and best possible way. So if in certain pockets within a discom's coverage, DRE offers a better sort of solution and economic viability, then I think they're likely to be more open to it.
So ironically, we're looking at 100% household electrification, but perhaps the opportunity now is even actually higher for DRE companies to be determined, right? Yeah. So Vijay, sorry, just because I visited some of your mini grid sites in Jharkhand state, and they were often your lines were often next to discom lines, or maybe even sharing some of those lines. How do you see this issue with relations to the mini grid space and companies like Husk Power or Tata Power coming in apparently to play a bigger role here?
Yeah, William, you're absolutely right that when we started work on the mini grids in 2015, 2016, there was a huge amount of hostility on the ground from the discoms. They really wouldn't give us the time of day, so to speak. Wouldn't tell us where the grids were going, which were the off-grid villages, and we were kind of stonewalled. There aren't any off-grid villages in the state of Jharkhand. We found that wasn't the case, and we started working on our own. Over a period of time, the whole thing has changed, and it started with a little bit of tacit cooperation on the ground, in the sense that all the grids, all the villages that we worked in, they're all already connected to the discom, to the regional grid. And these lines run almost parallel, as you said, to the mini grid lines. And when they had to do maintenance work, they would request us to switch off our grid. And when we did that, they gave us permission to switch off the transformer of the discom grid. Started with that, and slowly, when there is some extension work to be done, they would ask us if they could take help from our poles, because they used to take a very long procedure for getting new infrastructure done. So we did that, and then when we needed to do certain extensions and the government poles were available, they would let us use their poles. And this kind of a thing slowly built up, and over a period of time, the Central Energy Regulator, the JERC in Jharkhand, he got us together with the JAREDA, which is the state nodal agency for renewable energy, and the DISCOM, the JDVNL. And we sat together and had a discussion as to how we can cooperate and make this thing better. And they sort of understood that the strong point that a DRE player has on the ground is that the survival of the DRE player actually depends on demand creation. You need to have about 1,500 units of demand of electricity from a village, and only then you would have a model that'll be profitable. And they understood that part, and they also understood that they had limitations. They're brilliant, let me tell you, at creating infrastructure on the ground, as has been done. So almost 100% connectivity the DISCOMs have achieved to the villages, and almost every house today in India has got access to the line. The problem is it's very difficult for a government agency to really run a business, and there are many examples of that, not just in India, anywhere in the world. We have a flag carrier airline that's not doing too well. Government telecom communication had the first mover advantage, but they're not good at running business. They've created infrastructure, and as you said, what's going to happen going forward? Yeah, they've created the infrastructure, and I think going forward it will be a mix of a public-private partnership, or it could be a franchisee model. There are many models that are sort of being experimented with, and right up to downright privatization in the urban areas. So I think that's the way it's all going to unfold in the future.
Yeah, thanks. So I want to there are a bunch of different topics here that I want to get into, but just before I move on, I want to go back to one of the comments, Piyush, you made about commercial viability and whether the assumption that the private sector can address these last mile consumers and businesses in a commercially viable way, and whether we're not holding ourselves up to an unfair comparison, right? I mean, the DISCOMs haven't had a commercially viable business model ever for last mile communities. Why should the private sector be held to a different standard? That's one question. And it's also related to the question that we just got from Dose Sasuga, sorry if I'm pronouncing your name wrong, from Togo, that if energy is a social good at the end of the day, and we're talking about the poorest customers, many of them can't afford these types of solutions, right? So that gets also to the point of commercial viability. If you're trying to serve a customer that might not be able to afford some of these products and these services, how can you be held to a standard of commercial viability? So before we move on, I want to make sure we get to that question and see first, Piyush, if you have any thoughts. And Vijay, don't feel like either of you don't feel like you have to comment on every question. If you feel like there's enough's been said, please just let me know.
I think there are a variety of situations out there, and there are a variety of customers. Some of the energy consumers out there are able to offer or pay economically viable prices, and several others aren't. So I totally agree with the notion that we shouldn't try to pretend that a certain DRE solution serving the poorest of the poor is going to be economically viable. That's not the idea of what I was suggesting. But what I was suggesting is that in the context of a private sector DISCOMs taking a fresh look at, okay, how do I organize distribution of energy across my territory? DRE has a new opportunity of presenting itself a credible alternative in the overall energy mix for that particular DISCOM's coverage area. If it were able to operate commercially in a commercially feasible way for the target customer segments who are able to offer or pay commercial prices. A lot of the difficulties that we see in the energy sector are because of the leakage at the DISCOM level. It's as high as sort of 40% in the sort of underdeveloped states that we're talking about, but even the country average at this point in time is around 25%. So if you start to remove that leakage from the system and start collecting revenues for the remaining 25%, there is a good chance that the numbers add up, and if not massively profitable, we are talking about a self-sustaining energy ecosystem. I hope that clarifies.
Yeah. I mean, I think you're just saying that there's a lot of nuance, right? It's a multi-segment market that we're talking about, and it'll be different for each segment. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
I just got something to add to this. It's a very complex issue. This what we're talking about. Is it commercially viable? So if you were a private developer and you were given a choice of the market, and every private developer chooses the market that they want to service, that they want to work in, And if you were to choose the villages, which were really, really, great on the entrepreneurial kind of curve, good communications, everything going for them, except for the fact that they don't have reliable electricity, then this model is hugely commercially viable. So it's just a matter of, as we understand, keeping the capex at a certain level and the opex, also at a certain level, and ensuring that there's adequate utilization and the tariff is the negotiated tariff in any case. So it's very much viable in certain segments. Now, is that what we are trying to achieve? So is it that every village in India or every village in the world and anywhere, irrespective of where they are on the developmental path, communications-wise, exposure-wise, markets-wise, doesn't everybody have a right to electricity? So if you look at it that way, there is a huge social good part of the whole thing. So somewhere you need to draw a balance between a very, very commercially viable village, which would get you great profits, and it doesn't take more than 3 to 4 months once you set up the grid to get 100% sort of consumption of electricity and then move on to the next level. And there are villages which are extremely remote, poor, primitive, tribal, and they take almost like 4 to 5 years to even understand how to convert their electricity into kind of an entrepreneurial model or even use it for their own benefit. So how does one kind of balance these two things? And that's the $1 million question. But let me tell you, if you are a private developer and you want to do mini grids on a huge scale, and you could select the villages that you want to do, as Tata Power is doing now in UP and Bihar, it's on a huge scale. They got the scale ensures that the costs are minimal. The kind of clustering ensures that the operational expenditure is not so great. The village selection and the market selection is so good that there is an assured demand for electricity. So, but is that the end game? Are we looking at electricity for all and entrepreneurial development opportunities for all, or just a commercially viable model? So there are commercially viable models there, and there are very universal kind of models which need a certain amount of help to make it commercially viable. If you look at countries in Africa, in some countries, in developing countries in Southeast Asia as well, so there is a huge support from the government, from multilateral agencies, in order to sort of subsidize the capital expenditure infrastructure. And therefore, that's one of the ways forward, how to take this forward.
Yeah, so what I'm hearing is that integrated electrification, public-private partnership, but it's going to be a mix of things that are perhaps commercially viable, but also not commercially viable, and therefore different models that will deal with each of those scenarios. Quickly, just before there was a technical question about, maybe both of you can very quickly respond. What is the cost of a kilowatt hour for a mini grid in India and for a solar home system in India? That's a question from Gerard Hendrickson.
So I'll go first for the mini grid system. So there are many kinds of mini grids. So I'll look at something that provides 24/7 electricity and has a quick backup, or kind of a reserve system like a battery bank plus either a generator or a biomass gasifier that can quickly come in and look at peak load management, and also as a reserve backup in case of bad weather. So, and if you had a system, a grid that connected to the entire village, and let's say there are 200 household village, and the distribution line runs to about 7 to 8 kilometers. So roughly the cost would be in the region of $3 to $3.50 per watt peak. Yeah.
And that compares to what from a discom, assuming that the discom is available?
Say again, William, I didn't get you.
Compare that to the discom price.
So the capital expenditure in case of discom would not be all that less if you looked at the capital expenditure part, because the generating station on an average would be at least 100 kilometers away, and then you have a transmission line coming, and then there are substations, there's transformers, and then there's lines coming in. So compare that with what is really to be compared is what is the revenues that a discom manages to get, because given the tariffs that they have, tariff structure that they have, and the kind of demand generation ability that they have, or the lack of it. So a 100 household village where we work would generate a revenue of not more than 2,000 to 3,000 Indian rupees per month for the discom. The same village with a mini grid with somebody working on the demand side of it would be able to generate at least 60,000 to 70,000 Indian rupees per month. So you look at the complete 30 times or 40 times would be the revenue difference. So it's not right to compare just the capital expenditure part. You have to look at the entire thing in perspective. So you looked at the LCOE, the levelized cost of electricity over an entire lifetime cycle. And I think the mini grids are somewhere in the region of, depending on how good they are at controlling their OPEX, would be in the region of 20 to 30 cents per kilowatt hour. And if you look at the discount prices, they would be at the moment they are hugely subsidized, and they're probably 1/5 or 1/6 of that. So that will give you a rough idea how to compare these two things.
Okay, Piyush, you want to come in or no?
Okay, so for a solar home system, at the prices at which they are currently sold in India, over a use life of say around 8 years, the levelized cost of ownership at my last calculation came out to around 15 US cents per kilowatt hour, which on the face of it compares adversely to the cost of the electricity provided by the government. As we just said, it's heavily subsidized. But that's not the only cost which the customers incur towards filling their energy deficit. They use anything from candles to kerosene lamps to diesel to a variety of other ways in which they try to meet that deficit. And all of that is sort of part of their energy budget. So when a customer is evaluating this sort of a decision for themselves, they do actually factor in all those different costs and hassle of arranging all those supplies to meet their energy deficit. And the overall equation for them compares favorably, which is why many of them have opted for decentralized solutions already.
Yeah. Okay. So we got a lot of questions coming in. So, and we got a limited time. So I think we're gonna have to speed this up slightly. So India's got a lot more population density than other energy access deficit countries, and like in sub-Saharan Africa. There are other differences, but given what we're seeing in India, do you expect that this is a model for the type of integrated electrification that we're going to see in other countries? Is India sort of paving the way for other markets, do you think? Piyush, do you want to go? Vijay, go ahead.
Yeah. So I think the biggest lesson is that the government is done a great job of getting the infrastructure down to the last home. The last mile connect has actually been achieved over here. I think the important lesson is beyond that. It's not just getting the infrastructure there. It is that the government is not so good anywhere in running businesses. So I think the lesson here is that yes, the government should either subsidize or actually be part of the building the capital infrastructure. But when it comes to running the business, it has got to privatize it or give it to a private player, franchise it or whatever. So this public-private partnership model, I think, if taken forward, we are not yet there fully. We just, I think there are a few green shoots here and there. But when that happens, I think that would be a model for globally.
Piyush, do you agree with that? Anything to add?
Yes, mostly. I think I'll just add that you mentioned Africa. So India, in comparison to Africa, is probably further along the energy adoption curve. And some of the patterns that we have seen play out in India, like the push towards larger systems, the push towards larger appliances, the size of systems increasing quite rapidly over short periods of time because of the customer habituation factor. All of those trends, I think, are also going to be relevant for energy ecosystems like Africa as they start to tail India on the energy adoption curve.
Yeah, so we've been talking, there's been a number of questions about subsidy. You've both mentioned subsidy. I'd like to get to subsidy in a second, but in the meantime, there's also questions from Neil and Rena about whether, we talk mostly about rural settings. Is there an opportunity, a big opportunity in urban settings for these types of DRE models? And is there a possibility for a feed-in tariff for some rooftop systems within cities?
Let me take that one. When I think of DRE, I think of DRE as either a technology or as a customer value. And I think from that standpoint, it's as relevant in urban as it is in rural. DRE, energy ecosystem, thanks to evolutions in technology, is decentralizing around the world. The biggest corporations are worried about how the whole energy landscape is changing and are sort of making adjustments to their respective business models. So it's not just a very sort of narrowly focused group of people like us who are applying DRE in the development context, but it's a broader trend which is playing out in the energy sector. And there's a huge amount of potential of creating self-powered devices, things like which come with solar patch on, simple things like mobile, which will be self-powered at some point in the future, all the way to systems which are providing complete sort of energy solution to a household or a shop or even a factory for that matter, to a solution which is providing a backup access or solutions which are running complementary to the grid access. So centralized as well as matching decentralized and centralized energy sources. So there's a whole range of possibilities out there, and many of them apply to urban as well, which is why we are starting to see traction in rooftops, even in urban settings. That said, the economics are not at this point in time all that attractive, partially for the reason that the technology efficiency needs to go further to make it possible for an urban home, let's take the example of a home, to completely switch to a decentralized source. As an urban resident, even if I aspire today to completely switch to a decentralized rooftop, I just cannot do that because there's just not enough roof space available to me in an urban setting. So at some point in the future, as panel efficiency continues to increase, as the prices also continue to go down, the equation will start to look more compelling. But yes, technologically and in terms of the secular trend that we are following, I do absolutely see an equivalent, if not higher, opportunity in urban settings.
Yeah, thanks. So just moving on, there's questions around many topics. So, there's around productive use, around profitability, cross-subsidization. Let's talk for a second about subsidy and how it relates to profitability in this sector in India. And whether, in a country where the government has traditionally frowned upon subsidy, there have been, I know, some CapEx subsidies available in rural India. There's also been, because of the subsidy issue, questions around tariffs. So all of these things are interconnected, but from a subsidy perspective, is subsidy required for companies like Melinda or Simpa Networks to be profitable? Is profitability the goal for these companies, or is how do they achieve a sustainable model? These are questions from Equatorial Power around whether they can be profitable. Questions from someone at Hamara about self-sustainability of these decentralized systems. As well as whether utilization and improving utilization can help achieve that type of profitability. So I'm curious if around subsidy, profitability, what's the connection? What's the future for the DRE?
Yeah, I'll go first on this, Piyush. When we started work 5 years ago on mini grids, they were like 80% subsidized. We were experimenting with technology, we were experimenting with modularity, we were trying to understand how to build a model that would be financially viable in the long run. And of the 80% subsidy, I'm very happy that the Ministry of New and Renewable Energy in India, they pitched in with almost like 30%, and the rest 50% came from our own foundation and from like-minded foundations. So it helped us. Subsidies really helped us to hone the technology, the technical specifications, how to run these grids, how to get productive use going, how do you design it in a manner which is more towards productive, leading towards productive use rather than the domestic use, and how do you sort of get the tariff structure, right? How do you get smart metering going? So the whole lot of technologies we had to experiment with, and we needed those subsidies. The second part is scale. So you need scale if you want to make it commercially viable. The third part I've already touched upon, that there are villages which are more suitable from a site selection point of view, from a commercial viability point of view than the others. So if you look at commercially viable villages only, and you look at you're able to have scale, you don't need subsidies even today. But if you have a mix of villages at 50-50, 50% good villages, 50% normal villages, just like any other, and you selected them at random, and they occur that like 10-15% would be great villages, and 10-15% will take a very long time to reach that level of utilization. So I think if that were the case, at the present cost structure that we are in, we need something like 20-25% subsidy on the capex. So this is one way to look at it, but it is possible. I mean, to have a completely zero subsidy model, but then you would be working in a different kind of villages. The villages you would select would be commercially viable to you as a private developer, but that's not really what any government would want.
Thanks, Vijay. So part of the whole equation of profitability also, or revenue also, scale comes from productive use. And there have been a lot of questions around the role of productive use for standalone solar as well as for mini grids. Questions around solar water pumps and what the future holds there. In your experience, from a solar home system perspective or from a mini grid perspective, are you seeing that this is a reality, that productive use is actually going to be a major driver for DRE growth in rural settings, or is this some sort of myth that we've contrived and we're trying to sell to the development world? What do you guys see in terms of the future of productive use with DRE in India?
Let me start on that one because I have some points of view which I hear are not very popular. So you may be interested in hearing them. I think I find this whole discussion around productive use as self-limiting for the sector. I see the value of using that expression as a sales message. If you're trying to appeal to a customer that, okay, well, we're offering you something which will enhance your income and therefore it could be self-funded for you. But I mean, I think you use the word contrived. I want to ask a question to all of you. Is a good night's sleep for a farm laborer so that he can go and earn his wages next morning a productive use or a consumptive use? Is the comfort of a fan through the course of the night a productive use for him or a consumptive use? So I think some of these notions are sort of really gray and may serve a very limited purpose. But if this discussion and is about sort of the sector and the policy, then I don't think we should overuse that way of thinking, because it actually could be self-limiting. I mean, why are we judging about people and how they want to be using electricity rather than letting them decide for themselves and focus more on offering them a compelling proposition?
Vijay, I know you want to come in on this one.
So yeah, I absolutely agree with Piyush on what he said. We shouldn't have a limiting kind of a definition for these things. But so I just narrated a short history of how this productive use thing came about in our case. So we were working in the Sundarban in the islands adjoining the Sundarban jungles in West Bengal on a project which was to do with reversing environmental degradation in the tiger reserve area. Now, so over a period of time, the model kind of changed into energy access model, a poverty elimination model, but the only thing we could come up at that point was a picogrid system, a very small system of 100, 200, 300 kilowatt peak, which would connect 10 houses, provide them with 5 to 6 hours of electricity in the evenings. Now, we worked with this, it was funded by the Apex Rural Bank in India, NABARD, and then went on public sector banks like UBI, started financing it directly to the community. And this spread in a very big way on 6 islands of the Sundarbans, and from there the government asked us to take it to a place called Purulia, Ayodhya Hills area, which was at that point a left-wing extremist kind of a concentration area, and the government couldn't penetrate, so we moved in there with these very small systems and electrified 36 villages between 2013 and 2016. Jharkhand government had a similar problem with left-wing extremism, and then we moved onto the islands in an arc down below from there to 3 districts, East Singhbum, Simdega, and Gumla. And after working with the tribal populations for almost 7 years, they came to us and said that, listen, we're very happy that we have improved our quality of life. We now have electricity for 5, 6 hours. Our children can study for longer hours. Our women can cook in the evenings and so on. But what we really need is for us to go to the next level. And we want you to power, supply with electricity that can power machinery like irrigation pumps, rice dehusking plants, wheat milling plants, and so on. So if we had, and there were large ones, diesel ones, which the people in the plains had, and these guys had really nothing. So when we started looking at that, we sort of realized that we have to give them 3-phase electricity, and that was a problem even today with DISCOM. Even though the lines are there right up to every house, the quality of electricity is like 110 to 160 volts, and you really can't run, though in theory it is a 3-phase electricity, you can't run any load beyond 3 kilowatts there. So therefore, if the villagers really never had a chance, in many villages there was no electricity and at all, and even when it came, it was of such poor quality that they really could not use it to make a livelihood out of it. By this I mean that they could run agri-processing machinery, they could run large irrigation pumps to build large acreage of land and make some livelihood out of this. And therefore, when we started looking at this, so it really occurred to us that this daytime, and mostly the use is during the daytime, and it can be used during the daytime. It could be an approach, a habit that they're using it in the evenings, but they could use it early morning when the sun was there and evening before the sun went down. And therefore we started with just irrigation pumps and agri-processing machinery. And slowly it moved on to other uses, small businesses and so on. And we found that it took a kind of a momentum of its own. It wasn't really not that we went there and said, okay, we're going to do productive load. The villagers came to us and they said, listen, can you do this? Can you supply me electricity for this foundry, for this compressor to sort of fill air in a tractor tire, or for painting, for metal fabrication works, for construction machinery manufacture? I mean, it just went on and on and on. And then suddenly we found that every village we had almost like 30 to 40 machinery running, ranging from irrigation pumps to foundries to carpentry shops to computer, Xerox machines and so on. And the list was just, and it kept growing and growing. So this leads us to a kind of a thing that it's not something that you have a debate about. It's something that's a requirement. So sometimes you feel that are you doing the right thing by introducing all these kinds of things? And what really happened was when we started putting electric machinery over there, they were 3 times faster than the diesel machinery. So if a rice hulling machine part with diesel could do 100 kilograms an hour, electric machine would do 2.5 to 3 times that much. But what happens to that extra produce? One is of course saving in time. The other part was, is there a market for it? So we got into market linkage. So here you are, and then when you started looking at the market growing, the market really wanted not X tons of mustard seed oil, but something that was 15 times that much. And if you had to get that done, you have to go on to the productivity side and ensure that that part of mustard seed was grown by these guys. So somewhere it became a holistic developmental model rather than just a limiting model, as Piyush was saying. So it's not something that you can control. And sometimes you have this philosophical question as to whether you're doing the right thing by putting money in their hands. This is really what they want. They were leading a happy life before we went in over there as primitive tribals. But then when you look at the spin-offs in the sense that in terms of healthcare, they can afford better medicines, go to better doctors, better education for their children, good schools and so on. I think you're doing the right thing. So I don't think we need to have a debate about whether productive loads are required or not. It'll happen anyway on its own. You just need to provide quality electricity, reliable electricity, and give them whatever little it takes in terms of business advice and maybe a little bit of financing, and they'll do it themselves.
Yeah. So, I mean, we're getting into the topic of sort of impact, social economic impact on these communities. And there have been a number of questions from Marie at NRDC, from Paul at PowerRoll around, curious about some more detail around that. I mean, Vijay, you talked about what these types of things can do to contribute to rural development. Questions around how many jobs are created by the companies that are delivering these types of solutions. Also, what are the most popular productive use applications? Obviously, there's the Kusum program in India, which is a huge investment in solar powered irrigation for farming. But what are the other applications that you're seeing most in demand from both the standalone solar and the mini grid side? So 2 questions: jobs, and then other applications besides solar irrigation that are in big demand.
Let me take the one on jobs, and then I think I'll pass on to Vijay on the various applications of DRE. So I think on jobs, there is obviously one approach to look at what is the current size and scale of the whole industry and how many jobs it has created. But I like to think and make all of you think in a slightly different way. I like to remind all of us that, look, energy is a force multiplier, right? Historically, over the last several decades, specifically in India, GDP and economic growth has been fueled by population increases. With India now achieving a replacement rate of population growth, we're not going to see population increases continue to contribute significantly to economic growth. So the economic growth is actually going to come from productivity increases. If we remind ourselves of the sort of production function of GDP growth, we have to lean more and more on productivity increases going forward, and recognizing that energy is a force multiplier and provides leverage to human effort. We need to place energy in the hands of 65% of those youth who are going to be driving the economy of tomorrow, not just within India, but also globally, and place enough opportunity in their hands to be productive and contribute productively to the economy and society. So this is not a micro question around what investment have we made in the sector so far, and therefore what jobs has it produced at this very moment. It's actually, as we were discussing earlier, a broader trend which is playing out gradually over time. We'll have to do very long duration impact studies to actually properly understand the sort of third order impacts of these interventions. But please recognize that that 2/3 of the population or youth of tomorrow are actually growing up in rural India. Up until now, their opportunities have been constrained. They have mostly relied on manual labor. Even factories and even sort of industrial units have employed people over technology or over automated processes with very limited sort of productivity outturns. But by placing energy in their hands, by giving them this force multiplier, they're actually going to power ahead not only their livelihoods, but the whole economy and opportunities for everybody. Over to Vijay for the question on various applications.
Thanks, Piyush. I'll just mention a little bit about the jobs as well. The jobs is a very delicate thing to look at. One is that you're creating some direct jobs in these villages, which is you're employing village entrepreneurs, technicians, people who are running machinery and so on. On end-to-end businesses. And then you have secondary kind of jobs where the people helping out these agri-processing machinery, cleaning seed, winnowing, threshing, there's a lot of drying, a lot of stuff going on around that. And beyond all this, is another set of jobs that is creating in terms of logistics, in terms of moving things from one place to another, warehousing, and so on. So it's a holistic thing, this whole productive load business. It's not about just a single thing like you have one operator over there. And most important of all, there wasn't enough irrigation available, or there was irrigation that wouldn't work because of constraints of diesel, fossil fuel, machinery, the pipeline maintenance, and so on. And once you get this entire thing under your wing and start making it run efficiently, you suddenly find that about 4 to 5 times the original amount of land that was being cultivated in the off main crop season, which was paddy over there, non-paddy crops, grew by 3 times, 4 times. And that results in more people having work through the year. So what really happens in most of the Jharkhand villages where we worked in was that in the non-paddy season, once the harvesting was over, they would all move out for jobs, and they would come back around this by July, August of each year, and then come back in November just for the harvesting, and then move out again and come back sometime in June, July, just before the monsoons. So, and they would go out and work in very menial jobs. They would work as cleaners, assistants to drivers, assistant cooks, and security duties, guards, and so on in big cities. And it's not that it is a means of livelihood, but it's just that they had a far more dignified and a better existence in their own villages. And so we did prevent about 30 to 40% of this kind of migration which happened for jobs seasonally. And I think that's an achievement by itself. So that's about jobs. The other part is what is the range of productive loads in a village. So it all starts with nothing initially. So these villages are not really exposed to quality electricity. They don't have 24/7 electricity. They don't have 3-phase electricity, and they don't have electricity where they want it, which is maybe where there's a check dam, a canal, a place for a foundry shop, or this is where I have land and my carpentry shop is going to come up here, which is maybe 600 meters outside the village limits. Now the grid won't go there, or it's not possible for a system to power a kind of machinery that this particular entrepreneur has. So it's almost like limitless, the kind of jobs, the kind of entrepreneurships that you can create. Starting from very basic things like irrigation, all kinds of irrigation machinery. Then you go on to agri-processing machinery, rice dehusking, grain milling, corn pulverizing plants, and then you have things like oil expellers, and from there you go on to other aspects like cold stores, other things like harvesting, winnowing machines, and then the entire range like carpentry, metal fabrication shops, welding, the entire thing. So there's really no limit to what kind of entrepreneurs you will end up sort of incubating. It's all just quality, access to power.
Is there anyone that in particular that stands out? Because we only have a few more minutes, and I have a bunch of other questions that I want to get through. One or two applications that stand out. Anyone? No? Okay, I'm going to keep moving on. So we have about 5 minutes left. There's a bunch of questions that have come in. We haven't had a chance to get to other questions, but I'm going to try and go through a few questions quickly, if possible. So if you could keep your answers just focused and as quick as possible, maybe we can try and get through a few of these quickly. So the first is around financing and the fact that there's no mobile money really to speak of in India like there is in Africa, where pay-go is a really prominent model. So that raises the questions around access to finance for consumers, but also the greater question around access to finance for companies and whether the ecosystem in India is suitable for scaling DRE. There was also a question about blockchain and whether that's got a potential. So quick answer to that question, both from a consumer finance perspective as well as a company finance perspective and where we stand.
Sure, I can start with that one. The situation on mobile money is actually changing. What you said was certainly true till about 1.5 years ago. But over time, a number of wallets have been introduced by Google, WhatsApp payments, even Truecaller payments. So customers are now linking these online payment or mobile payment tools to their bank accounts. Remember that they opened their Jan Dhan bank accounts 2-3 years ago. So almost everybody has a bank account now. That bank account also has some funds because over time they've been receiving direct benefits from the government under various schemes. And they're now also linking these Jan Dhan accounts to mobile payment applications. So the possibility or the opportunity to collect payments and reduce transaction costs on collections and service fees is actually much better today than it used to be. That said, the financing ecosystem remains constrained, challenged. There's been a push from the government to banks to lend to SMEs. There have been some very favorable moves from the government, which also have benefited the DRE sector as a whole. Things like expanding the definition of SMEs, things like including startups or introducing relaxations for startups to actually receive foreign funding in the form of debt, which opportunity previously never existed. So I'm referring to the external commercial borrowings amendments which were introduced last year. So there have been some sort of favorable developments, but broadly speaking, the development of a domestic infrastructure remains patchy. It's more developed for temporary capital debt than it is for permanent capital, i.e. equity or long-term debt. But we need to do more to bring financing into the sector. So that's the sort of current lay of the land.
Thanks, Piyush. Vijay, I'm just going to keep going to the other questions since we've got a lot still out there. Quick question on electric cooking. Is it an opportunity? Do you see it as an opportunity either for solar home systems or mini grids?
No, I think it's something that's catching on quickly. Right now, it's sort of restricted to the top 2% of each village. I mean, I'm talking about income bracket people who can afford this sort of thing. That's in India, but surprisingly, I'd gone to Nepal to see some of the grids which the government has put up over there, which Asian Development Bank helped, and in Myanmar, some villages where it's pretty well-to-do villages with most of the population, the males, out in Thailand for work or Malaysia for work, and a lot of remittances coming from there. They could really afford, and there's a huge number of electric cooking devices being used in the evening. Up in India as well, and that's mainly because of the gas LPG logistic issue problem. Yeah.
Okay. Piyush, so carbon offsets. Has anybody explored ways to capture and monetize carbon offsets from switching people from dirty fuels to DRE?
Yes, we've done that at Simpa. We were able to monetize the carbon that we were saving by providing the decentralized energy systems to our customers and aggregating them, and then selling them off to a third party who was interested in buying them. That was through an intermediary organization. It wasn't a hugely sort of revenue generating opportunity for us at that time, but our whole objective was to prove that this works. And we did that, we achieved that. So, I mean, I can go as far as saying that that possibility definitely exists. It ought to be developed further. It's possible. Whether that can become a credible source of alternative revenue for organizations working in the sector remains to be seen at two levels. One, are they able to achieve the scale at which the amounts become meaningful? And two, do the carbon markets themselves become efficient enough for them to yield any meaningful benefit against the credits that they're generating?
Yeah, we were reasonably successful at this as well, and we got not a great price, but about 4.5 euros per ton, which is not bad. And looking at the overall position, as Piyush said, since it was related to the utilization of energy and not what you would generate, so at that point of time, we didn't have a lot of utilization of energy going on, but today at 60-70% utilization, I think almost 10% of your revenues would come from carbon credits.
Yeah, so I think we're at time. I have one last question that sort of relates to COVID, and then we can wrap up. You know, in terms of so there's been ruptures in demand forecasts from COVID. How does that allow India to leapfrog to a better market design that includes DRE in a more meaningful way? And is the grid, healthy enough to take that in? If assuming that there is sort of a leapfrog to a better market design coming out of COVID. Last question for the two of you.
Okay, I'll go first. I think it's a little premature to give a very comprehensive response to that particular question, but there are some themes which are already emerging and may define what actually happens in the energy sector as a whole, but more specifically in DRE. There's definitely something about self-reliance. Through disasters like these, people have come to appreciate the value of owning their own resources, not just energy resources. But if you now present them an opportunity of owning their energy infrastructure independently from the grid, and they're more likely to sort of respond positively to it than they have in the past. There is evidence from the ground that this is happening, which I am privy to. Secondly, again, I think disasters like these bring into sharper focus the value of DRE. I want to remind everybody of what happened during Cyclone Fani in Odisha about a year and a half ago, or almost 2 years ago. There was no sort of field movement, and there was no possibility for the discoms to provide service or repair to their facilities at that time. And DRE solutions saved the day for many customers. Thirdly, I think still a little nebulous, but there is a connection between health, which is what COVID relates to, health and well-being, and then environment responsibility, and not sort of causing pollution. Not everybody is, particularly in rural India, is thinking the same way, but COVID has shaken them up and made them realize that there are other risks to health than just a disease, and they got to be alert to it and respond to it.
Thanks, Piyush. Vijay, you get the final word.
Yeah, so I have a very different experience with COVID, and except for March when revenues went down by 35%, the revenue started picking up from April on, and we actually revenues went more than 100% of what was expected from between April and August. So, and also one would have thought that with the lockdown in place, many factories shut, there would be a surplus of power energy available with the discoms, and then the wages would get much better electricity than they normally would, which was not the case really. So the problem on that end is something else. It's not about availability and supply. It's other things. And and the government declared the mini grids as an essential service, and they provided with transport, with passes to ensure that we work through the lockdown, and they ensured there was vehicles running to pick up the produce from the fields and take it to the markets. And I think the migrant labor came back to the villages, a lot of money in their hands, and these grids did extremely well. So I really agree with Piyush that it's too premature to sort of speculate on which way this whole thing will go, but I think it's going to be a positive thing for mini grids and DRE.
Great. Well, thanks to everyone for joining us, and especially thanks to Vijay and Piyush. You can learn more about CLEAN, the CLEAN Network, the India DRE Trade Association, at their website, thecleannetwork.org, as well as Vijay's company, Hamara Grid, and Piyush's former company, Simpa Networks. For additional information about Energy Catalyst and to keep up to date on future episodes of Lessons from the Frontline and other events, funding opportunities, and much more, be sure to visit gov.uk. See you again soon on Lessons on the Frontline.